Chuck, Season 1 Review. So this is part of what I've been calling my television addiction series, in which I go through and I talk about all the TV shows I watched in 2011 and 2012 when I was living in Cambodia and was watching way too many DVDs. For more information on exactly what this series is and why I'm doing it, I made an introduction video to the whole project, which I'll link in the description down below, but for today, Chuck. So, who remembers this show? Or who out there is still watching this show? I get the impression that this is another example of a TV show that was very popular in its day, but has just been completely forgotten about in the years since. But let me know what your experience or your perception is in the comments down below. I've heard it's been taken off of Netflix now, so I don't know how widely available this show is now, but you may remember this show had a big cult following back in its day, and that cult following was news of sorts. Now, I was in Japan when all of this was unfolding. I think the show came out in 2008, in which time I was still in Japan, and in fact I was living abroad throughout the whole run time of this series. So I would only hear about it in bits and pieces, but I guess what my understanding is, it was heavily hyped upon its release. It was on NBC, and they were doing loads of promos for it. Apparently commercials for it were everywhere. But then its ratings flagged, I believe, after the second season, and it was what they call on the bubble for cancellation. And it was only renewed after a huge fan campaign to get the series renewed. People writing into the network. Apparently people even trying to encourage the sponsors to support the show. Like Subway was a sponsor, so people would go and buy at Subway in order to encourage Subway to keep funding the show. And it worked. The show got renewed for another season, and then apparently it was the same crisis at the end of every season, whether or not it was going to be renewed, but fan support ended up getting it 5 seasons before it finally came to an end. And if memory serves, I think I first heard about this because of people making jokes about the fan following. I think I was in Japan and I was watching The Daily Show. And you could watch The Daily Show off the Comedy Central website back in those days. And back in those days it was the golden age of The Daily Show, so everybody was watching it. And Jon Stewart was making jokes about how, millennials were more engaged with Don't Cancel Chuck than they were with the political issues or something like that. Which, I don't know. There may be some truth in that. It's always a little bit disconcerting how much more passion people have for their entertainment than they sometimes have for actual substantial issues. But then again, that's nothing new. I mean, Star Trek, of course, was infamously saved by a fan writing campaign. And Star Trek was right during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement and all of the chaos of the late 60s. So that was definitely during a time when there were other issues that could have engaged people. Well, and maybe people did both, huh? Maybe they were involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement and they were still writing in to save Star Trek. Anyways, point being, I found out about this show kind of through all this, through the coverage of the fan campaign to get it renewed is when I think I first heard about it and the cult following. So when I was in Cambodia and had access to these DVD stores, which were just selling a lot of cheap packaged DVDs, I purchased Chuck Season 1. I knew it had a cult following. I had heard a lot of great things about it. And watched the show, and yeah, it was all right. I didn't love it, but it was all right. Now, to be fair, I've heard from people, both people I know, personal friends, and also kind of commentators on the internet, that the first season is the weakest, and apparently does get better after that. But I wasn't hooked by the first season, but I was charmed enough by it. If that makes sense, I'll try and get into a little more depth explaining my feelings. Actually, I've been trying to figure out exactly what Chuck reminds me of, and I can't quite put my finger on it. But when I watched the show, and at the time I watched it, I was living in Cambodia, living abroad in my mid-30s, and I had an overwhelming feeling of nostalgia for the TV of my youth. For the kind of innocent shows that would be on TV in the 80s and 90s, the kind of family adventure shows. And I was trying to put my finger on exactly what show Chuck reminded me of, or exactly what genre. And I can't do it. I don't know, maybe this is just kind of an imagined nostalgia. But I can't figure out which show Chuck reminds me of, but it definitely gives me a vibe of a more innocent time in TV. Like, gives me a vibe of you're out with your high school friends, or maybe your high school youth group. You get a bunch of junk food, like you have pizza or Subway maybe, and some Coca-Cola, and some popcorn or something, and you're like, hey, let's all watch an episode of Chuck. It just seems like a very kind of like crowd-pleasing show that's got some comedy, some romance, some action, no real hard edges. It's just kind of a very soft, warm, fuzzy show that is easily enjoyed. And maybe, I don't know, that's what the nostalgia is. I don't know. I've been trying to put my finger on it exactly, but it did give me some sort of like warm, nostalgic feeling for the TV viewing I used to do in my adolescence or in my teenage years. And maybe it's just the vibe of the show, maybe than any specific plot structure or something like that. At the same time, though, the show was, how do I want to put this? There was nothing really in the show that grabbed me and made me feel like I had to keep watching. So it's meant to be a cross between comedy and action, and romance thrown in as well. And the action was okay, but it was nothing great. And the comedy was okay, but it was nothing so funny. And the romance I could absolutely take or leave. And there were overarching storylines broadly, but this was still back in the old days when TV was still in that transition period. So each episode was pretty much self-contained. And although there were some themes that got gradually developed, it wasn't quite TV in its serialized form as we know it nowadays. So it definitely was not like Game of Thrones or anything, where you get to the end of one episode and you're like, oh, I absolutely have to put in the other episode now. You get to one episode and you say, okay, well, that was the end of the episode. I'm going to bed. Which didn't encourage binge watching. And who knows, maybe that's a good thing. But this was a period in my life when I was binge watching DVD sets. And Chuck definitely didn't pull you along. You didn't feel like you absolutely had to watch the next episode. I was looking at the commentary of the AV Club from season 1. Which I quite often do, because I find that the commentators on the AV Club are a lot sharper than I am. They often articulate things that maybe I feel as well, but I wouldn't have been able to put into words, or kind of maybe looking in the back of my mind, and then after I hear them say it, it definitely rings true for me. Anyways, in this particular case, the commentator on the AV Club, the reviewer on the AV Club, was saying that Chuck is in a long line of NBC shows where the show looks aesthetically very pleasing. You know, the lighting and the cast looks very photogenic and is all full of handsome people who look the part, and it just looks very polished and has great production values. But it's just not all that funny. Is the review the AV Club gave to it, and I think that describes my feelings as well. It definitely looks the part, and you do feel like warm and comfortable when you're watching it. Like, oh, okay, this is a network television show that looks the part, but I did not find it. I found it moderately funny, but certainly nothing. You know, like with a really great comedy, there are some jokes that you get stuck in your head, and then the next day at the office, you're like, hey, did you see the episode of such and such yesterday? Boy, they had some great jokes in there, or something like that. Nothing like that in Chuck, at least for my money. At least in season 1. Now, the premise of this show, in case anyone is not familiar, is that Chuck is a kind of slacker guy in his mid-20s who's working at a store called the Buy More, which is like a stand-in for Best Buy. And he's working at a place in the Buy More called the Nerd Herd, where they help customers who have issues with their electronic equipment, which again I think is the stand-in for the Geek Squad. And he gets an email from his old college roommate. His old college roommate is working for the CIA, and he opens the email, and the email downloads all these government secrets into his brain. Don't ask. It's one of those shows where you just don't question the premise too much. Somehow he got all these government secrets downloaded into his brain. So he is walking around like a walking, talking security breach with all these government secrets downloaded into his brain. Oh, and also the original file with all these government secrets got destroyed. So the two government people, one from the CIA and one from the NSA, goes to try and grab Chuck. And initially they want to take him back to a government cell, but then they agree to let him stay and live out his normal life, although that's a tension throughout the rest of season 1. Is Chuck going to be able to continue to live his normal life, or is he going to get dragged away into a government cell because he's got all these secrets and he's too valuable to be walking around now? So they're protecting him, making sure he doesn't fall into the wrong hands, but they also need to use him as an asset. So for example, if there's a spy that they need to catch, then they'll bring Chuck around because he's got all the info and all the intelligence downloaded into his brain. So it's an action comedy crossover. Chuck and all his coworkers at Buy More are kind of the classic workplace comedy. And it's one of those comedies where they're all kind of one big happy family. And again, this is where I said I was getting those warm feelings of nostalgia of television viewing from my youth mixed in here. They're a lovable, dorky crew. And then he's also got the spy adventures going on the side, and he can't tell anyone that he's carrying around all these government secrets. So he's got to keep that separate part of his life hidden from his family and his coworkers. He's living with his sister, and his sister's boyfriend is another major character in the show. In addition to that, the CIA operative is a very attractive woman. Sarah is her name, and she is pretending to be Chuck's girlfriend as a cover for why she's always hanging around Chuck. So there's a cover story. But she's also very flirtatious with him, and part of that is the cover. But she is often seems to be more flirtatious than she needs to be, leading Chuck to get his hopes up that maybe there's something going on between them. And as the season 1 progresses, you get hints that maybe there is something going on between them. So it's your classic will they or won't they sitcom couple. And if I had been a little bit younger and a little bit naive or hadn't seen so much TV, maybe that would have hooked me in a little bit more than it did. But because I was a little bit older and cynical and I knew how these things operated, I thought, okay, well, this clearly isn't going anywhere for several seasons at least. This is just the ongoing tension that they're going to use to try and keep the viewer coming back for more episodes. And every episode, it looks like maybe they're going to fall in love and start the relationship. And then it'll pull away just at the last minute. And sure enough, that's just exactly how season 1 played out. It was so boring. It's, I mean, if I think somebody younger, maybe seeing this for the first time, who's not aware of what a cliche the will they or won't they sitcom couple is, might have gotten hooked in it more. But it just bored me to death, that whole kind of semi-romance between them. Chuck, within the premise of this TV show, is supposed to be a huge nerd, and all the characters treat him like a huge nerd. The AV Club pointed out that it's a little bit unrealistic to have a guy as good-looking as Chuck, and seemingly as charismatic as Chuck, be portrayed as a nerd. And he's portrayed by, what's his name? Zachary Levi, is that it? Or Levi Zachary? It's the same guy who played Captain Marvel in the DC Comics Shazam. So, not Billy Batson, but after he says Shazam, he transforms into Captain Marvel. And in fact, after I saw Captain Marvel, I don't remember if I said this in my Captain Marvel review or not, but I was thinking, that guy looks really familiar. Where have I seen him before? And, you go to Wikipedia and you're like, that's the guy who plays Chuck. So clearly an actor with a lot of charisma, as was portrayed when he was doing the Shazam role, and doing that with the Chuck role as well. And the AV Club said it's, one of their criticisms was it's completely unrealistic to have him portraying a nerd. But that didn't bother me so much, to be honest. I bought into it enough. And all the other characters were treating him like he was a nerd outcast. But then having established that he's this huge nerd, it seemed to me like it was a little bit unrealistic for this gorgeous, hot woman, the CIA operative, to be falling in love with him or contemplating falling in love with him. I don't know. Speaking of the AV Club, another one of their criticisms is that they said that I thought this was well phrased. They said that for any TV show, you've got to give it a little bit of slack on the premise. So this completely nonsensical premise where Chuck somehow gets these government secrets downloaded into his brain by opening up an email, fine. Just go with it. The fact that the CIA agent looks more like a model than a CIA agent, fine, just go with it. But they said eventually these kind of unbeliefs are just going to pile up on each other. And I believe that the phrasing that they used was, Chuck has already wrote more checks than its shaky premise can cash. And they said that, the fact that Chuck is just walking around in Buy More and allowed to continue with his normal everyday life when he's this huge national security liability if he falls into the wrong hands, seemed to be a little bit of a bridge too far for them. I don't know. I suppose you've got to give that some space as a premise as well. So in Buy More, Chuck has a lot of quirky co-workers. He's got his best friend Morgan. There's overly ambitious guy whose name I'm forgetting, who's kind of the jerk of the group. There's Jeff and Lester, who are kind of the quirky, weird characters. There's, I think, I'm forgetting all their names, but there's a group of quirky characters who are the Buy More staff. And they all look like they're comedic gold and that they should be really funny. But as I said before, I didn't really find that it was hilarious. I don't know, it was funny enough. The action scenes as well were decently done, but nothing that really had me on the edge of my seat. And because of just the way this show is set up, because it's got such an innocent and wholesome vibe to it, you just know that the characters are never in any real danger. Not that need to spoil the action flick, because... Sorry, not that need to spoil the action scenes, because that's doubtless true of any number of TV shows or movies. But, yeah, I guess maybe that combined with unspectacular action made it... I don't know, the whole thing was entertaining enough. Just didn't grab me. I finished season 1, and I was fully intending to go on to season 2, especially because people told me that the series does get better as you stick with it, but I just never got around to it. And again, it wasn't because I hated the show. I found it pleasant enough. It was because the show didn't grab me. So if you've seen Chuck, let me know in the comments down below what you thought of it. Did it get better as the seasons progressed? And are people still watching and talking about this show now, or is this show completely forgotten nowadays? What do you think?